Hey there everyone, BradyBot here. And today we're going to be talking about how to understand bidding decisions in any form of scoring. I'm going to be talking about some bidding concepts, mostly in terms of IMPs, as inspired by one of the most recent team matches that I played on BBO with a couple of friends. But we'll also discuss some of the match point concepts as well, and how to apply some of the critical decision-making that we want to employ as bridge players in competitive, constructive auctions, part scores, games, all of that sort of stuff. This video itself is going to be focused more on the beginner or intermediate player, but I will touch on a couple of more advanced concepts and techniques, and eventually get to a point where I will demonstrate a process for which you can, on your own, apply some of these techniques to your own analysis of bidding problems. So this is going to be a bit of a short presentation. Here's a quick overview of what we're going to get through. We'll talk about a bit of a simplified analysis using some underlying assumptions. We're going to be covering both match points and IMP strategy. And the main focus for this simplified analysis is going to be on the big picture. We want to focus on overarching concepts, and rather than get bogged down by a bunch of the details. And we're going to use this to develop some key takeaways about, in particular, IMP bidding. And finally, at the very end of the presentation, I'm going to get to some mathematics, show you how to derive IMP odds for a couple of different scenarios, and maybe present a fact that I think a lot of experts would be familiar with, but maybe some newer bridge players would not be. So I'm going to present a couple of common situations that you might find yourself in. Here's one of them. Your partner opens a diamond. Your right-hand opponent overcalls a spade. You have the 7 count with some diamond support. You decide to bid 2 diamonds. Goes 2 spades, pass back to you. And you have to decide, am I balancing? Should I sell out to 2 spades? So that's a common scenario. Another one would be this, where now rather than making a part score decision, you're making a decision at the game level. This time you've opened a spade with your 13 count. They overcall 2 hearts. Your partner makes a limit raise, and they get into the 4 heart contract. And it's back to you. You have to make a choice. Now, I'm not going to come back to these. I think both of these scenarios are rather straightforward, or both of these hands in particular are rather straightforward at all forms of scoring. In the first one, I would bid 3 diamonds 100% of the time, no matter what form of scoring, no matter what the vulnerability. The second scenario, I would be passing 100% of the time, regardless of vulnerability, regardless of form of scoring. But these are the 2 situations that I'm kind of thinking of. And so rather than imagine these hands in particular, just consider these auctions as we move on to the next slide, where I'm going to show a couple of tables after we talk about some of the simplifying assumptions that we're going to make. So to simplify our analysis, we're going to assume, for starters, no one's vulnerable on any of these hands. We're also going to assume no one doubles, because doubles can obviously bring into the picture double part scores making, or going for 800 in certain hands. And so we want to kind of simplify what we're thinking about, just so that we can get a takeaway about generally what the right thing is to do. We're also going to assume that there's only 2 possible results. We're either making our contract or we're going down 1. Same thing for the opposition. They were either making their contract or they were going down 1. Again, bringing into the possibility of making over tricks or going down multiple tricks would make our analysis a bit more robust, but we're just trying to keep things a little simpler here. Another assumption we're going to make is that half of the field is going to bid with our hand, so essentially compete either for a game or part score, and half the field is going to pass. Now for match points, it's pretty clear what that means. For IMPs, we're going to be discussing cross IMPs so that we can talk about a field where a large number of bridge players are facing the same problem, and half of them are choosing one thing and half are choosing the other. And because in a real imp game, there's only one choice being made at the other table, and we could think of the other table always doing the wrong thing and seeing how profitable we could be, but I think this is a bit more realistic, where it's a close choice, and you would expect about half of the time someone does the right thing and half of the time someone does the wrong thing. And finally, as a simplifying assumption, we're going to presume the opponents are never going to compete further. And for many bridge players, you know this isn't the case, and we'll actually see why when we get to some of the key takeaways from a little bit later in the presentation. But if we balance, we're going to make the assumption the opponents pass us out, they don't double us, they don't bid on to 3 spades or 5 hearts or something like that. So this is just going to make our job a little easier to look at the big picture. And so here is a giant chart of match points and imps. Remember cross imp, so we've said there's a giant field of players, we're getting imp scores against all of them. You can think of it like a match point result, where we're comparing our imp result with every other pair in the field, and we take an average. And so I've given the results for both part score deals, this 2 spades versus 3 diamond auction that we saw, and the 4 hearts versus 4 spade auction that we saw. So a part score deal, a game deal at both match points and imps. The values inside the cells in our charts are going to represent the best action for us to take. So in the top left, the part score deal at match points, when both sides are making the contract, it is correct for us to bid 3 diamonds. And because we assumed half the field was bidding 3 diamonds and half the field was passing 2 spades, we would score 75%. If you take a look across the 2 match point tables, you'll kind of notice this concept that the best action results in a 75% board every time. It doesn't matter whether it's a part score deal or a game deal. It doesn't matter if you know, who's making or who's going down. We always get the same result, which leads us to believe that match point decisions are equally valuable, whether we're playing in a part score deal or a game, or a slam, for that matter. And at imps, we see something that you might expect, where game decisions, for example, bidding 4 spades over the opponent's 4 hearts, can earn us a sizable chunk of imps if we've done the right thing. But something to notice is that it looks like the only scenario where passing is correct is the scenario where both sides are going down. And this is kind of a direct consequence of some of our assumptions that we made. For example, no one's vulnerable. If we were vulnerable and we bid a contract, down 1 versus them making a part score is 0 imps, or almost equivalent. At match points, that wouldn't be the case. -100 versus -110, kind of a big deal. But at imps, it would be worth 0. And of course, similarly, this concept that no one's doubling anyone else, and that we're only going down 1 trick if we make the wrong decision, does play a role as well. But you can kind of clearly see that at imps, obviously in the game realm, bidding game tends to be very profitable. And it's not even a particularly huge win if we guess wrong when we happen to be going down. For example, if they're down 1 and 4 hearts and we're down 1 and 4 spades, bidding on to 4 spades doesn't lose us a ton of imps, but we would be really hard pressed to make back those imps if 4 spades happen to be making in that scenario. Then we could win a sizable chunk by bidding 4 spades. So, with all this in mind, here are a couple of key takeaways. Surprise, bridge is a bidder's game. If you've heard this phrase before, then this is kind of where it comes from. That it tends to be profitable to compete with the opponents for both part scores and game contracts. You don't want to just timidly pass all the time, thinking, oh, I don't have enough values, I'm scared, maybe we get doubled and go down. We'll get into doubling a little bit later, but it does tend to be profitable to bid. And something else that I kind of mentioned, that bidding decisions at match points are equal in weight, but IMP decisions do depend a sizable amount on the auction level. We saw that in the part score box that we looked at, the most you could win was about 3 imps if you make the right part score decision, and that's only if both sides are making their contract, which might be a little easier to diagnose, as opposed to the game decisions where bidding game can earn you 5, 6, 7 imps from cross-imp perspective, and can earn you definitely a little bit more if you were just playing in a generic team match where you could earn 13 imps by bidding and making a game if they go down at the other table. Finally, part score decisions at imps do revolve around whether or not we're making our contract a bunch. And it doesn't matter all that much if the opponents are making their contract. Take that example that we gave of 2 spades versus 3 diamonds. If we're making 3 diamonds, we want to bid. This mitigates some of the underlying assumptions we made. For example, vulnerability doesn't matter if we're making our part score. The opponents doubling us doesn't matter if we're making our part score. I mean, we would welcome them to double us if we were making it. So for a lot of those reasons, it's very valuable to consider whether or not we are making our contract, and that's going to lead to us deciding whether or not we want to compete at imps. Now, this kind of leads, if you take a second step further in the analysis, to this hidden consequence, where if we're making bidding decisions at imps about competing for part scores, specifically, based on whether or not we think we're making our contract, that has the implication that we actually have extra values. And so whenever we have extra values, it doesn't directly say that we have game interest. We're not inviting our partner to bid game every time we balance. But there is this implication that we have some extra values, and therefore our partner, if let's say they have a complete maximum for their auction so far, can actually consider bidding game once we make a balancing bid, or once we compete for a part score. So it's a bit of a tricky concept, since I think a lot of bridge players will have this belief that when your side has elected not to bid game yet, then you can't bid game later in the auction. But this idea of, oh, maybe 2 maximum hands for their auction so far can actually produce enough extra tricks to bid a game, this is kind of where that comes from. So I would say tread lightly if you're thinking about raising your partner to a game just because they've balanced or just because they've competed for a part score. But you can definitely think about doing it at imps as long as you and your partner have this underlying understanding that part score decisions, more or less, you should focus on your side making the contract rather than just trying to be pushy and being competitive. So when it comes to game decisions, though, at imps, obviously these are influenced a little differently, and they tend to be influenced by whether or not the opponents are making their contract. It's true that if we happen to be making game, we should of course bid it. It tends to be quite profitable to score plus 420 or plus 620 on some hands and 4 of a major. But if the opponents are going down, doubling them can be quite profitable. Like, consider the vulnerability. You're pretty certain the opponents are going down in 4 hearts, and you're trying to decide, do you want to bid 4 spades? If they're vulnerable and you're not, the only real losing scenario for you is if they're down 1 and you're making exactly 10 tricks. But maybe they're down 2 and you make 10 tricks. Well, 500 versus 420, still a small win, even at imps, and at match points it would be a huge win. And of course, if you happen to be going down, then it doesn't really matter whether or not you're making your contract as long as you double them. But counter argument is if the opponents are making, it's generally correct to bid over them. For one thing, the opponents might then bid to the 5 level or a higher level, over compete, and you've pushed them up a level. And now you can decide, do you want to double them? Do you want to pass? But secondly, you're not really costing yourself a lot of imps. So again, like we've kind of talked about this 500 versus 420 thing, you would have to be going down more than 2 tricks for it to really be a disaster for your side to compete over their game, as long as you're confident they're making it. Now we're going to conclude with a little bit of math. So this is going to be a small amount of probability to analyze 2 different scenarios about whether or not we want to be bidding game and how often we want to be bidding game at imps. So the first scenario is going to be a very simple one. It's something that we've more or less already talked about. No one's vulnerable. No one's going to be doubling. We're going to make 10 tricks, so 10 tricks in a major suit, so game with probability P, and therefore we're going to take 9 tricks with probability 1 minus P. So there's 2 possibilities. We either take 10 tricks, game makes. We take 9 tricks, game is down 1. And these are the only 2 options. And in this case, we're going to assume we're playing a normal team match. So the other table is playing in 3 hearts. Question we want to ask is what value of P makes bidding game profitable? And this is kind of the calculation that we get. The coefficients I put out in front, so 6 times P, we're going to win 6 imps if we bid game and we make it. We're going to lose 5 imps if we bid game and it goes down. This gives us a probability that we need to break even of 5 out of 11, which means anytime our probability is more than 45% of taking 10 tricks, we should be bidding game. Now, if we do the same calculation, if we're vulnerable, we get the following result, that the probability of bidding and making game needs to be more than 38% if we're vulnerable to break even. So recall, this is simplified scenario. No one's doubling us, and we can only take 10 or 9 tricks. There's no taking 8 tricks. There's no taking 11 tricks. So that means, and this might be surprising to a lot of bridge players, that we should be bidding games that go down more than half the time if we really want to optimize what we're doing. But you might argue, okay, that's a very simple scenario. Sometimes the opponents double us. What's the difference? Well, taking a look at the second scenario that I've laid out, in this case, we'll start out with not vulnerable once again. This time, we're going to assume that there's possibilities of taking 10, 9, or even 8 tricks. You know, bad splits could happen, a couple of finesses could lose, something like that. So 10 tricks we're going to make with probability P again. 9 tricks this time we'll make with probability Q. And 8 tricks we're going to take the rest of the time, so probability 1 minus P minus Q. The second assumption that we're going to make in this scenario, though, is that every time we're taking 8 tricks, the opponents are going to double us. This will often be due to some bad trump split or something, or maybe the opponents just have a large amount of values and we've overstepped. And so this is kind of an extreme case because, as everyone knows, there are times where we bid to game and go down 3 and the opponents don't double us. Even good, strong opponents can overlook the warning signs in our auction that we might not be in the right spot. So finally, we're going to say that the other table plays in 3 hearts. And the question here, once again, is when is bidding game profitable? Well, it turns out if we plug in the math, we get to this final equation, 12 times p plus q is greater than 6. And again, if the probability of making 10 tricks is more than 50%, we will once again be profitable for bidding game despite all of the harsh penalties that we've imposed on ourselves. So we require a little bit of a higher percentage than the 45 that we calculated in the other scenario. If you run through these numbers with our side being vulnerable, you come up to a similar consequence, which is that we need the probability to be a bit more than 40% for bidding game to be profitable. And that's kind of all there is to it. So again, even if we make these assumptions that the opponents are doubling us, sometimes we go down multiple tricks, it's still very much worthwhile in an imp setting to be bidding games. And so you can work out some of the details for yourself. But that's going to wrap up the presentation. I hope you enjoyed. It was a bit of a shorter talk. Make sure that you like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, you know, all of that normal jazz. If you're enjoying these quick talks about some bridge concepts, and I hope everyone has a great day. See you all next time.